So good afternoon, everyone. I suspect that there are people still out there rummaging around trying to find food, but contrary to Houston Institute tradition, we're going to try to stay on time. I want to start off by introducing a friend and colleague of mine. Before I do that, I'm going to tell a story, though. Earlier this week, we did an event called Beloved Streets of America, and it was an event about efforts to revitalize the 900 streets in this country named after Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which we find in a state of really serious disrepair. And when I went to talk to one of my colleagues here, I said, we're having this guy, Melvin White, here. And they said, who is he? Where is he, right? And, I said, he's just a guy, right? And so he's a former postal worker who's taken it upon himself. But there's this impulse here to try to locate people within some institution or within, kind of grant authority to what they're about to hear because the person is from some university or from some nonprofit. So I'm going to introduce my colleague, Lolita Parker Jr., who gave the official bio. This is what she submitted as her bio. Originally from Los Angeles, relocated to Boston in 1993 for the weather. Now, I happen to know, I learned this morning, that she wrote that from Hawaii, right? And she is back here now. I also know she's not from Los Angeles, she's from Pasadena, right? Is where I'm from. So we went to the same high school, but separated by quite a few years. I do want to say that, and the other thing that is that Lolita is also an artist of the first degree. She is a photographer of really unparalleled talent and vision, and she is our artist in residence. But today she comes to us as one of the other driving forces behind this event. She had a vision and a commitment to put this on and to make sure that we did so in a way that actually helped us move forward. And so for that, I'm really thankful and appreciative because in addition to an artist, she is a kind of historian, community organizer, and just all around good person, even if she's nuts to love the weather. So with no further ado, Lolita Parker Jr. Thank you.
I've been a photographer for 40 years. Everyone can hear me fine with this mic? Probably can hear me without the mic. One reason I'm a photographer is because I can't sit still. So for me to have to sit on the panel and moderate, that wasn't going to work. So I asked, could I walk? So I first want to ask everyone, when you saw this title, Race, Racism, and Mental Health, why did you come here? You don't have to answer out loud, but why did you come here? What did you hope to learn? What knowledge did you hope to get? What did you want to take away? Because as someone who has been shooting these types of events, since I was 16, I have been to many events where what I call black and brown pain has been put on display. You come to an event, you hear the statistics, you see a documentary that uncovers another horrible incident of someone being murdered or maimed or something terrible, and I would leave crying and upset. But rarely did I ever leave with something that I could do. And so when I met Bob at a conference in Springfield, one of the first times I put my camera down, and I said, well, let me sit down and interact with people, see what I can learn. And he told me about his interest in organizing this conference, and I said, I want to do that too. So here I am. So you saw me this morning as a photographer, now a moderator. This is my first at-bat as a moderator, I'll tell you that. So like everything I do, it's probably unconventional, but so what? That's what we have to do now. We have to come out of the box, not anyone in this room, from under the sheets, take the sheets off, peel back the onion, do all the things that we need to do so that this system of oppression that it hurts us all. This is called the impact of everyday racism. One example I'm going to give of everyday racism, my high school football. We have a homecoming in Pasadena, California. I'm actually from a suburb north of Pasadena called Altadena, to be more exact. But at our high school football game, the homecoming game, there's primarily a black school and a white school. It's played at the Rose Bowl. It's a big deal every year. What happens? I go to the game, and on the black side, there's a bail bonds company handing out key, what do you call these things? Lanyards that talk about bail. And I've been using that now for maybe 7 years. I carry it every day to remind me of all the little ways, all the little chips that get taken out of people of color, but not just people of color. I mean, I used to imagine that I could walk into a space as a white male so I could see for myself if I could get treated differently. I know the answer to that is yes, because I've been challenged in ways that I wouldn't have been challenged, as we've heard earlier this morning. If I had been a white male, I wouldn't have been challenged in many ways that I've been challenged in my life, especially as a photographer. When I first started in photography at 16 in 1972-ish, there were only white males. And they were elbowing me out of shots and saying that my camera wasn't as big as theirs was, and so I did things. I got longer lenses, I got the proper gear, and I was still getting pushed out of my shots. So we're here today with our panelists. I'm actually going to ask that you each just say your name right now.
Yes. Good afternoon, Abigail Forrester.
Good afternoon. My name is Nyamuon, Nguany, Machar.
Could you speak up a little bit,
Sure.
please?
My name is Nyamuon, Nguany, Machar.
My name is Phillipe Copeland, and my kids call me Dad.
And so Phillipe is going to start us off today, but the one thing that really helped me at a Houston Institute event, I didn't cover it. This is my son right here in London. He's going to be the photographer this afternoon. He went to an event last spring that was for prosecutors, and one of the takeaways was that black people and brown people needed to stop opting out of jury duty. And so I didn't, and I got to serve on a special grand jury for 4 months. And what did I hear? What did I hear over and over again was that, mental health concerns, it was like the parade of mental health concerns, passing before the grand jury. And I was able to make a difference in that process. It was small. It didn't change the outcome of who went to trial. But when I held my hand up and said that I wasn't going to put a title of, career criminal on a 21-year-old, then I didn't do that. And then other people say, well, why didn't she do that? So it never was the 12 people needed not to make that career criminal choice to a person who was under 25, but I got people in the room to think. And that's what I want us all to do, is that, I see Boston, I came here, I do like the weather here, I'm from LA, I got tired of the drought, fire, mudslide syndrome. Okay, so I'm here for the weather, that's true. But what I would like us to, I say that Boston is a place where several times a year, the smartest, hardest working people from all over the globe come here to get smarter and work harder. Would anybody agree with that? No. Okay, well, but I would imagine if we could combine the IQ of people in this room, it would be pretty high. We showed up here, despite the weather, despite whatever else happened, and so I really want us to really just, I don't know how to say it, swim in these intellectually, rich waters and come up with something either through questions or comments that we can take home and use with us. So with saying that, Phillipe?
So what's up, people? Y'all all right? So I wanted to start with a little experiment because I go to a lot of conferences, and I just want to make sure that I came to the right conference. all right, that I didn't wander into some other conference. So I'm going to invite you to engage in an experiment of call and response, because I want to know who's in the room with me, all right? It's very simple. We're going to get some movement energy in here right now, all right? When I say Black Lives, how should you respond? Matter. Oh, y'all know what I'm talking about. I might just be in the right place, but I'm not quite sure. Let's try that again. When I say Black Lives, matter. Good. One more time. When I say Black Lives, matter. Okay, one more time, but this time, y'all remember that old movie, Back to the Future? Remember what happens when he plays the guitar? And it knocks him, like all these young people are like, what y'all talking about? The older people are like, exactly, right? But anyway, visualize me getting knocked out of my socks by your voice. Voice has power. So this last time, I want you to say it as if you were speaking that truth into the space. You feel me? Say it like you need to prove it. Okay? We're going to do this one more time. Show me what you got. Black Lives Matter! That's what I'm talking about. I'm in the right place. So, thank you for doing that. I hope you feel a little bit of movement energy. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to share a little bit of something I've been working on and thinking on that's about the relationship between race, racism, and mental health, very much inspired by a powerful ancestor, W.B. Du Bois. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how his work has influenced my work. And the first thing related to that is really trying to figure out what is a healthy mind. What is a healthy mind, and what are the conditions necessary to achieve and to maintain and preserve a healthy mind? So I got a little bit of insight from the World Health Organization, who wrote that mental health is a state of well-being in which every individual realizes his or her own potential, can cope with the normal stresses of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to her or his community. In other words, freedom. Freedom. Scholars and some activists will call these things substantive freedoms or substantive rights. But part of what I've come to understand is that mental health is not just the absence of disorder, it is the presence of freedom. Y'all feel me? So I'm going to talk about freedom today, okay? And how that relates to what we are talking about here. Now, obviously, racism is the antithesis of freedom. Anybody know what I'm talking about? Okay. But what are we talking about when we talk about racism? Based upon my experience and effort to understand my adversary, this is what I've come up with. It's got 3 basic elements. The first thing, racism is a way of deciding who gets what and what they can do with it. It's a decision-making model, okay? So things like rights or resources or opportunity or power, and indeed life itself. Decisions are made about who lives and dies, and racism is a way to do that. Second, because of whom the architects of racism were, racism is a strategy to deal with a problem. They faced a dilemma. And the dilemma facing the architects of racism was this: how do we claim a set of values, but get away with betraying those values constantly? How do we claim to believe and put in writing certain things, but do the exact opposite to acquire wealth and power? The answer, the solution, racism. Because racism makes those decisions appear to be rational decisions and moral decisions. In essence, they no longer are a betrayal, they are just everyday behavior. Everybody knows that. Everybody does that. How could it be wrong? It's common sense. Third, Racism is the consequence of those decisions and all the various games that people play to rationalize those decisions. Y'all hear me? All right. So that is what racism is about. So how might this be connected to issues of mental health? Obviously, racism is the antithesis of freedom. So one way of thinking about mental dis-ease is as a form of mental captivity. It's a form of mental captivity, right? Now, racism unfolds in all the different ways that we've been talking about this morning, okay? In all of these dimensions, and where these dimensions intersect is where it does most of its harm, right? So structurally, culturally, psychologically, and again, morally, again, I talk about this a lot, racism is a form of moral reasoning. There's nothing irrational about it, right? Now, one form that it takes is what has been referred to as racial capitalism. Racial capitalism. And racial capitalism, according to Cedric Robinson, is a couple things. First, it's really just a way of using racism and nationalism to generate and concentrate wealth. That's all it means. Welcome to the world in which we live. It's a racially capitalistic world, right? Now, the way that this works is that the first thing you do is you have to create the categories themselves, and you have to tell people that some groups of people are better than others. That's very important. However, you have to do something more. You have to also create nations. I'm going to say something that might sound a little bit radical to people in the room. Nations are no more real than races are. Did you hear that? They're no more real than races are, and they were created by the same people for the same purpose. To make it easier to dominate and exploit workers of all colors in all countries. All colors, all countries. It's a global enterprise. Well before globalization, these folks were already globalists, right? Before we had a word for it. The other thing, and we've been hearing a lot about fascism, right? We need to be okay with using the F word. Drop that F word, fascism. Get comfortable, get used to it, because we need to talk about it. Fascism and imperialism are forms of racial capitalism, and fascism is about economics, right? Ultimately, it's another way of accumulating and concentrating wealth. So, why is this important? Why would it be helpful to think about mental health in terms of racial capitalism? It does two things. First, I don't know if people have ever heard, but some people seem to think that we need to spend a lot of time arguing about whether race or class is more important. You ever hear that? You ever hear people have that argument? So Robinson says, guess what? It's both. So we don't have to do that anymore, okay? We don't have to have that argument anymore. Anybody starts, let's just say, C. Robinson, read his book. Okay? That's the first thing. It helps us get some clarity about the relationship of those things. It also helps us think about the ways in which the health gap is a symptom of the wealth gap. The health gap is a symptom of the wealth gap. So if we really want to promote health, guess what we have to also promote? Well, we got to close the gap, okay? And Du Bois helps us think about what that might involve. So this is from his seminal work, Black Reconstruction. And this is the way that he described the emerging racial capitalists of the post-Civil War era. He had a way with words. Industry for private profit directed at an autocracy determined at any price to amass wealth and power. The new industry had a vision not of work, but of wealth, not of planned accomplishment, but of power. It became the most conscienceless, unmoral system of industries which the world has experienced. It went with ruthless indifference towards waste, death, ugliness, and disaster, and yet reared the most stupendous machine for the efficient organization of work which the world has ever seen. Sound familiar? Amazon? Right? So these people are still with us. So fast forward, we're going to do a little bit of time travel. Think of me as like Doctor Who, but black, all right? little bit of time. We're going to jump forward in time to the second Reconstruction, 1960s, 1970s. How many people here have read the Kerner Commission report on civil disorders? Okay, so because I'm a professor, I'm going to give you some homework. Read the Kerner Commission report on civil disorders, 1968. In fact, don't even read it alone. Get your squad together, read the report, and discuss it, and then take like selfies of yourselves and put it on Facebook, all right? I want some evidence. This is a really important read, but this is one of the things that they said. They said, this is our basic conclusion. Our nation is moving toward two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. Discrimination and segregation have long permeated much of American life. They now threaten the future of every American. To pursue our present course will involve the continuing polarization of American community and ultimately the destruction of basic democratic values. Sound familiar? The alternative is not blind repression or capitulation to lawlessness. It is the realization of common opportunities for all within a single society. The reason it's important to read the Kerner Commission report is that this report was prophecy. We were warned. We were warned about the moment in which we are currently living. Now, fast forward 50 years, it's 2018. How you think we're doing? Did we listen? Okay, so let's see. Can everybody see the stats? I don't have to read them for you. So just take a minute and gaze upon them. 50 years later, this is what's going on. This is not what freedom looks like, is it? But it is what racial capitalism looks like. And sometimes this is what racial trauma looks like. Sometimes this is what racial stress and strain, the wear and tear on body and psyche of black folk in America looks like. And again, the gap is the goal. The gap is the goal. And if we want people to be healthy, we have to deal with the gap. We got to close the gap. All right, let's rewind back to Du Bois. So Du Bois posed a question that still resonates. It was a question facing not only the emancipation generation, but all Americans living at the time and since. He says, how is freedom to be made a fact? How is their freedom, emancipated Africans, to be made a fact? It could be done in only one way. They must have protection of law. And back of law must stand physical force. They must have land. They must have education. The abolition of slavery meant not simply the abolition of legal ownership of the slave, it meant the uplift of slaves and their eventual incorporation into the body, civil, politic, and social of the United States. So in other words, abolition is not just about ending something bad. It is about creating something better. You hear what I'm saying? That's what abolition is about. It's not the ending of something, but it's the beginning of something. How do we make freedom a fact? It's also about the difference between being free on paper and free in practice. All right? So this is what it involved, and I'm almost done. First, redistribution of resources, right? Civil and social rights, political power, sounds very straightforward. And education. And in this case, it's not just your ABCs, your 1, 2, 3s. It's education and how do you actually use resources, rights, and power to achieve self-determination. People need to learn that, and you need to invest in helping people to do that, okay? And of course, just like the way that racism works, when we think about this effort, it takes place in all of these dimensions. Now, why might abolition democracy be helpful to us? It allows us to shift from talking about mental health in terms of treatment to talking about mental health in terms of movements. Movements. You see the difference, right? So what might our movement involve, right? At the very least, I think it involves these things. So structurally, we're in a fight to end racial capitalism and achieve social justice in America. Culturally, we need to end white hegemony, all of the ways in which racism is rationalized through culture and language. We need to end those things and replace them with social justice. Psychologically, we need to end the empathy gap. That's another gap. bigotry, hatred, resentment, and racial stress and trauma, and achieve mental health. Free minds are the goal. And morally, we need to end value gaps and achieve moral maturity. We need to grow up, y'all. I mean, really, we need to grow up. And social ethics. And I'll close with the words of Dr. King. These were among his final words in his last public address before his assassination. And I wanted to end with this. He said, "The nation is sick. Trouble is in the land, confusion all around. But I know somehow that only when it is dark enough can you see the stars." Something is happening in our world. The masses of people are rising up, and wherever they are assembled today, whether they are in Johannesburg, South Africa, Nairobi, Kenya, Accra, Ghana, New York City, Atlanta, Georgia, Jackson, Mississippi, or Memphis, Tennessee, the cry is always the same. We want to be free. And I hope you will join me in the fight for free minds. Let's get free, y'all. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. Very motivating talk. My name is Nyamuon Machar. I come from Maine. I'm a regional coordinator for Youth Move Maine. We are a youth advocacy organization that helps young people be emboldened by their lived experience and use that story to also break down the stigma in the communities and really start to speak out for change on a legislative and policy level. So with that being said, I'm coming from a background of lived experience. A lot of my talk today is going to be from that lived experience because it informs a lot of the work that I do. So the mental health system we see today was developed and geared towards a Western demographic, and as alternative, renewed, and revived engagement methods and practices are investigated, we run the danger of perpetuating practices that are damaging and not all-encompassing. When we fail to have representation at the meeting tables, trauma-informed practices have become the staple way many organizations have attempted to try to be more alert of hurtful, neglectful, and sometimes discriminating practices and ways they may be engaging communities and people one-on-one. Though needed and encouraged, one missing component in the deliverance, training, conversation, execution of trauma-informed practices is the understanding that trauma translates in different cultures, economies, environments, and communities. Therefore, being trauma-informed is not a mastered practice. It's being in a state of constant learning with a humble curiosity that is driven with a genuine empathy and intention to learn as we teach. In my community and in many communities, the traits of trauma manifest like an undetected cancer. The psychological ramifications of those traumas are passed down generationally, leaving harmful and self-destructive traits masked as coping mechanisms and skills on entire generations to keep your head down, or respect your elders and only speak when you're spoken to simply allow hurtful words to just roll off your back and become an impenetrable, undetected being in a society that is so hell-bent on building your narrative and telling you where it should and shouldn't go. These are just small examples of character traits inherited but sometimes developed, intensified, and morphed from a need to survive. I wrestled with what I should present today. Though the title and the theme of this conference are clear Though the title and the themes of this panel and the larger conference are clear, I didn't understand what perspective I should discuss as racism intertwines its way into so much of my life. This led to a community conversation where I would pick the brains of my colleagues, the young people I engaged, my family and friends, and the thoughts that would go on in my mind. All led to the same unfortunate realization that racism and the internal complexes created by the issue of race is embedded in most of my happenings of my day-to-day. I reflect back to my childhood and what would seem like trivial interactions with the white girls on the playground who would tell me my skin looks like mud. Yes, it seemed trivial, but I also realized that in those specific moments, there was a forming of a calloused mannerism and a defense mechanism that has now echoed into my adult life. As I work to advocate for disproportionate minority and immigrant youth in my own communities, I found myself having to create and wear a shield to protect my own person and my own mental wellness from the same racism that I was advocating for them, against the same racism that I was advocating for them for. What I'm about to say is not a jab at any entity, but rather an observation. When I first started working for my organization, I was very excited because our office was a stone throw from the project development that I grew up in and still had family and friends that lived in. I couldn't wait to see the robust programming that would have naturally developed from the trove of creative and driven young people that I knew were represented in that community. Being hired to work only one-on-one with referrals and not as a community engagement or outreach liaison, I had to hang my head again and bite my tongue when I discovered that no one had considered the community that was right next door. Of course, once I rose in ranks, I began advocating that we branch into more diverse communities and was fortunate enough to have the backing of my leadership. But it was sombering to reflect on the fact that it took someone who could relate or look like a demographic to advocate or speak to the need of that community, even if it was right next door. How high up does this go, I thought? Hypothetically, of course, knowing the definite truth. But what I kept thinking was, taking on the advocating role or the burden for a Black community did not make me any less sympathetic to white, Asian, or other youth outside of my color. And if it did start to go high up, how high up did it go? And it started to get me scared about the young people that I would watch start to interact with the mental health system. And in these times, I often pondered on my own trauma and the traumas of my parents, and I would constantly find myself asking, would the change so many of my peers rightfully advocated for within their own communities also be represented and encompassed in my lived experience and the individuals and or collective traumas of my community? I would often internally chuckle when I'm sitting at the advisory board meetings and various tables where as soon as the hot topic of culture was brought up, my voice somehow took precedence, being the only Black woman in the room. I was now adopted to be the ambassador of those from away, and all the questions that had to do with culture were slid to myself. In the beginning, not having learned the complexities of our mental health system from a provider standpoint, I basked in the prestige. Yes, I was African, I was a Black woman, I was Black and I was a woman. And so that made me some sort of expert. The more treatment tables I sat on, the more court appearances I was asked to be involved with to testify, I began to realize I was no expert on culture. Furthermore, my experiences as an African, as a Black woman, and as a Mainer was unique to myself, but was still relevant. I became a learner rather than a teacher, not only a learner from those in my community, but also combing back through my own navigations of the mental health system as a consumer. I remembered that all my interactions with my providers were so trivial and surface at best. I would often toy with the doctors and build up their egos and of them and the clinical social workers just to shatter them as punishment for their inflated egos from the assumptions that came from their Western books and understandings. Even today, when I think about my healing, the conversations are with a tribe of safe voices that I have developed and the ears that have gone through the things that I have gone through and have dealt with the things that I have dealt with. How powerful we become when we have the authority and the elevated platform to delineate and determine the words that will attach themselves to the experiences of those we work and interact with. I often wondered, what if rebel was never uttered that day in second grade when I came into the class after having been abused the night before, and I stood up in class and my teacher was bothered. She asked me to sit down, and I could not sit because my lower extremities were in pain. As I saw her getting closer and closer to my secret, not wanting to reveal that I had been abused the night before, I started to ramble through my head for things that I could use to start to build a defense mechanism so I wouldn't be weakened along my peers. Finally, she gave me the option of, are you being rebellious, Moon? Then, right there, I thought, would I be a rebel or would I be a victim? And very quickly, I chose rebel. And to this day, I lived up to that word, rebel, because rebel became my defense mechanism to the vulnerable parts within me that I was not ready to talk about. Again, how powerful we become when we give the narratives and the choices of which way we're going to go. I often rethink to that day and wonder if my teacher had asked if I just needed to talk, or if I needed to go to the back of the classroom, how differently my life would have went. Because that same rebel that she placed on me, the same stamp of rebel that she placed on me, also became the factor that made me one of the most popular people in school, that perpetuated the mask that was hiding my mental health symptoms. We are still a broken system. Not only is our mental health system broken, it has now become insidious. 3 years ago, I began working with a young man named Nguany. He joined our advisory board. Nguany played basketball with my little brother. And though he was tough and a big guy who didn't smile often, when he did smile, it melted and sparked up the room at the same time. Nguany wanted to study business, but our conventional school system just didn't seem to work for him. So many times we would talk about how we could equip him to maneuver and take the pieces of the education system that he would eventually need in a more cost-efficient way. We talked about tutors, finding classes, and things that sparked his interests. One of the things he often told me that haunted me to this day was that, Moon, I was just a basketball player, I was just a mule. They didn't really care if I could do math. As Nguany worked to advocate and carve out room for himself, the streets also called. Nguany would go in and out of jail for disorderly conduct and violations of bail. Before I keep going, I'd like to share that Nguany's older brother, who's also a childhood friend of mine, was sentenced to 35 years for murder, and this will be relevant. My older brother is also serving a 40-year sentence for a separate incident. But we would often talk to each other, and we would encourage each other by this way of being able to relate to the pain that we both felt. Nguany was clearly going through a deep sadness, and talking to his providers now, I'm so shocked by how much they did not know about Nguany and how much of his story was left out, ignored, or not even considered. Early last summer, Nguany and a group of young men were accused of rape of an underage American girl. 3 hours after the arrest, the arresting police officer alerted the media and forwarded Nguany's photo. Just last year, he was thinking about his prom, and this year, he was plastered all over the media for rape. Through an extensive investigation, the charges were dropped, and it was discovered that the young woman was threatened and was told that her parents would be called and asked which two of the narratives to move forward from. Again, the narratives that we get to control. I'm currently sitting on an implicit bias committee that meets in the very police department that leaked his photo. The media never returned to do damage control. And naturally, Nguany's reputation and the way the community viewed him changed drastically. I would often have to pull over and stop him from being jumped by grown men who believed he was a rapist. His spirit began to die. Not only was he dealing with the hardships of being a young black male, but now he had the stigma of raping an American girl. In November of last year, Nguany was found unresponsive in a Motel 6 in Lewiston, a town in Maine. He died of an apparent overdose. The days following his death and hearing the circumstances around his death devastated me. It had me flirting with the darkness I hadn't seen or felt in a while. I failed him. To everyone else, Nguany died of an overdose. To me, we murdered him as a system. From the police officer who turned journalist, looking at the numbers now of the reports in the media, there are so many pictures that get leaked of people who look like me than the people that look like so many others. To the therapists who didn't even know the traumas represented when a family loses an older brother to a prison system. Now talking to all his counselors who happen to work in the office right next to mine, I was completely shocked to discover that they didn't know that Nguany came from war-torn country, or what that might have meant like in his home, or what his mother might have had to deal with the current traumas going on in the country as it has now gone into its second civil war. To the regional coordinator, myself, who should have stepped in to investigate and interact with more of the systems to ensure that the lived experiences he represented were spoken to and edified. One of the most burning things is I still have the survey that Nguany took and it would periodically make itself to the top of my desk. It burns me to read through those questions, because what silly questions for him, I thought. None of these questions represented his struggle. None of these questions represented his potential, but these were the surveys that were now going to delineate how much funding that we got, or measure the work of progression, or what it looks like for a community to be successful. This survey did not save Garang, and is now putting a blanket over entire communities and muting their voices at the tables of policymakers and funding distributors. Again, what power we hold when we are the ones able to give the options of what the narrative will be and the descriptions of another person's struggle. So when I'm working with the young people, and I have to go back because I work one-on-one with young people in the community, and I always have to go back to meet with our contractors, with the collaborative partners that we have, one of the biggest shocks to me is what's missing. Not all the information that they're putting on the table, not all the bright ideas and the models that they have, but what's missing from the table. And what's missing from that table is a representation that looks like me, the voice that looks like me. So when I think about how to move forward, right now we're working with peer support. Peer support means having somebody at the table that has gone through the things you've gone through. So we're able to provide support for young people coming out of the Department of Corrections, from other young people who look like them, who are separated from it, but have gone through it, and can give them the confidence to start to speak up for themselves at those tables. It's really funny because probation officers call us paid friends, and that's how they try to disregard our voice at the tables, but paid friends have a lot of information because we gain the trust of those people that you're calling criminals, the ones that are only represented by your graphs and by your numbers. So that's why I think it is so important that moving forward, that we really understand how to take the stories of the people that we are working with and interact them and consider them when we're developing those policies. Thank you. Thank you.
Wow, powerful. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
All right, I'm gonna ask everyone to do one quick thing, because, I think one of the things for me in being asked by Lolita, and I wanna thank her for asking me to come to speak, I was just really thinking through this whole idea of racism. I just came from the American Public Health Association's conference in San Diego, and a lot of it, the conference was talking about health equity and racial equity and racism. Like this is like the big thing right now, right? It's like the buzzword, let's talk about racism. And, but I think one of the things as we sort of tie in mental health into this issue of racism in the discussion, we have to give ourselves room to breathe, right? So I have a tendency to always think about what is the compound trauma that we are all dealing with on a daily basis when it comes to institutional racism. And so we just heard a powerful, powerful story by Moon about the issues and the challenges of dealing with a system of racism. And I'm gonna focus on sort of structural racism. I was thinking about if I would have sort of labeled this out, I said race, structural racism, and mental health. Because the truth of the matter is, it's the structural racism for me, and you'll hear a little bit about my story that impacted my life at a certain point. And using the sort of Red Sox cliche, go champions, World Series champions, everybody with that? I had to reverse the curse. And so I think a part of what we're trying to talk about and we want to talk about is how do we reverse the curse? Right? And in my own life, I had to really sit down and had a chance to sit down. If you read my bio, you'll know that I did 10 years of incarceration from the age of 21 to 31, one of the first young men in the state of Massachusetts to receive a 10-year mandatory sentence as a first-time offender. No criminal background, not even juvie, but received 10 years straight, five-month-old daughter, 10 years straight because I wouldn't become a government informant. So when we talk about racism, we have to talk about, I think the bigger conversation is, what is the structural racism that is actually impacting the lives of Black and brown people, but the lives of people in general. So I'm gonna ask you to do one thing real quick. When I say go, I want you to just take a deep breath and let it out. Go. One more time. Go. One more time. Go. The reason why I'm asking you to do that is because as we continue to have these conversations, we actually develop a level of toxins in our body that cause us to actually become anxious in the middle of these discussions. And we don't even realize it. I think about how Phillipe asked us to say, Black Lives Matter. And in the moment of that statement, there was a level of anxiety that ran through my body. For a couple of reasons. One is I'm saying Harvard. I'm saying who's in the room. I'm saying, should we really be saying this? I'm saying, understand that this is how Black and brown people think every single day.
Every day.
Structural racism. Internalized structural racism. When I heard him say Black Lives Matter, say it loud, I said, oh, wait a minute, is this the right place? Who's in the room? Police? Anybody? No, literally, right? And there was a level of anxiety that came out of that. Because as much as we talk about freedom of speech, in structural racism, that only counts for certain people. So we got to talk about it. My name's Abigail Forrester. I grew up in Dorchester, town in Boston. My family migrated here from Guyana. And so I grew up with both on the back end of busing and with xenophobia. People who really didn't want to accept people from other cultures. Very challenging. And I remember when in elementary school, I went to a school called the Patrick O'Hearn. It was on the other side of the tracks, literally, in Dorchester. So you got the red line, right? The red line that comes out of here, but as you get closer to Ashmont Station, which is the last stop on the red line, at that time in the 70s, there was literally two sides to the tracks. So you had the top side of the tracks where most Black folks live, and then you had the flip side of the tracks where most white folks live. And so during the time of busing, as you know, many of you know the conflict of busing, elementary schools were also sort of integrating, and I was a part of that process. And I remember going to school when I was actually transferred from the school that was right across, literally across the street from my house. I'm talking about like where that grass is, like right there, to go to the Patrick O'Hearn. And on my walks to school every day, I used to have to run from like at least 7 dogs every single day. And I couldn't understand why that was the case. I would walk for a little while, sit on one car, then I have to get chased by another dog. But what was happening was white folks who lived closer to that side of the tracks would leave their dogs off the leash, knowing that Black children were walking to school. And so every single day, a group of us, we dealt with this. And God forbid if you were by yourself and you weren't walking with the crew, because you would be scared to death. Then when we left school, they used to have the teachers set up sort of like their bodies like a gauntlet, and we would have to walk through there, and folks would be outside with their dogs and trying to spit on us. And we did this for years. Structural racism. There was no police officers that came into the space. There was nothing to protect us but other people that would actually line up and say, you can't do this to these children. And so I want to fast forward and help you understand why I'm telling this story, because I think what we miss we miss the affect of what structural racism has done to the mentality of people in general. Not only here in this country, but I know earlier there was some talks about international racism and so on and so forth. But if you fast forward to about 2 years ago, I was sitting in the living room. As a matter of fact, it was at my mother's house, and it was around this time, and we're having this conversation, and I'm saying, yeah, and we're talking, and we're going back, and we're talking about the good times. And I said, you know, when I used to walk to school, every single day, I used to jump on cars. It was like, you used to jump on cars? What do you mean jump on cars? like you mean like, were you like doing something wrong? Well, I was like, no, like I got chased by dogs almost every single day walking to school. And what came to the forefront was that I never shared that with my family. Because as they say from a mental health perspective, when people are going through traumatic experiences, sometimes they black out. They won't even discuss the situations and circumstances that they're going through. And so we need to understand and really embrace and ask ourselves, what are the things that we have gone through? I'm not just talking about black and brown folks. I'm talking about even white people, right? As we have this real conversation, what are the things that are really impacting us as a whole that's causing us to black out to what we see today as institutional and structural racism? For example, there are a lot of folks who talk about, there's this another conversation around trauma-informed care and trauma. Everybody's talking about trauma, which I think is an interesting subject matter as well. But I tend to ask folk that are talking about trauma and are supposed to be trauma experts, when is the last time that they have cried when they saw a traumatic situation or violence on the television? When is the last time that they've heard someone other than themselves being hurt and injured and felt overwhelmed by emotions because of that situation that they have observed? Many of us would say, we can't even remember the last time we became emotional, because we don't understand that in this institution of structural racism, we all are victims, and some of us are even struggling with mental health issues. Because if I am not responsive to what I see in the pain overall of individuals, there's a part of my own humanity that has been lost. We're talking about race, structural racism, and mental health. Here's another piece that I would like to talk about in regards to structural racism. With all due respect to the institutions and academic institutions that we currently have, in mental health, they say, you're actually sick if you think that you're doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result, right? So for a minute, I want to, with all due respect to Harvard University, there's something that always concerns me, because I work in a field where I'm the director of community action at Madison Park Development Corporation, and I oversee 5 different initiatives: public safety, dealing with trauma, civic engagement, health equity and wellness, resident leadership and engagement, and youth workforce and leadership. And from time to time, there are universities, right? We're the university mecca that comes to us and says, we want to do another survey. They want to do another study. And so my question is, what happened to the study from last year? Or what happened to the study from 30 years ago? Because if you leave here and you go to Chicago, if you leave here and you go to LA, the same study with the same information, with the same feedback is going to tell you the same thing. So in some of the spaces and places that we frequent, that we educate ourselves, we need to understand, what is the structural racism in a repetitive process that continues to exploit and expose, and actually expose people back to their own trauma in order for the benefit of learning, that creates a problem in our mental health system. Are you following me here?
Maybe one more time.
I love education, I'd say, right? Again, I'll repeat myself. Lolita asked, so I have to do it. What about the systems that we are in its process of repeating itself, that constantly is exposing a population of people to their own issues with mental health? So I think when Lolita and I were talking, we were having this conversation about, how do we stop having the same conversation, right? How do we leave a conference and not feel depressed? That's why I asked you to breathe, because I really don't want us to leave here on a downer. I'm trying to say, there's work that we have to do in recognizing our own internal oppression and systems that we're a part of that continue to repeat the process of re-traumatizing and creating compound trauma for people who have challenges in our society. And so I didn't want to come up here and just talk about my incarceration, all the things that I've been through. No, what's important is, like Lolita said in her opening, how do we take action? So I talked about the fact that I grew up in this neighborhood that was seen as one of the death corridors in Boston. I experienced the back end of busing. I also experienced incarceration. So we're talking about compound upon compound upon compound trauma. And then I said, one of the things that I had to ask myself when I sat down was, how do I reverse the curse? And one of the things that I understood was that it was very important for me to unpack what I've gone through. And when I came to that conclusion, I cried like a baby. I was 23 years old and never had really unpacked these challenges that I faced growing up as a young man in institutions of structural racism. I never unpacked the fact that I had a principal who wouldn't send me to a school because of xenophobia, and she had issues with young kids who were born to migrant families, and was sending all the other kids to this school when I was an A student and got the honor roll every marking period. Structural racism. I had to understand that a part of doing this work was not about just doing the work of the other, but doing the work of the person within. And so when we talk about what's the action step, can we really look at the man and the woman in the mirror and ask ourselves, how has structural racism impacted me? Because I think too often we want to do the work of the other. Like right now, everybody wants to transform Trump. I say leave Trump the hell alone. And let's just hope that we can get through this. Because as much as there's an advocacy effort that needs to transform what's happening in the administration, what I see every day is the urgency of now. What I experience every day is the urgency of now. That young man who's carrying a gun in Roxbury or Dorchester who feels like he's worth nothing, he doesn't even know what Trump is doing. But what I can say to him is, baby boy, the pain can stop. You don't have to keep hurting yourself. We love you. We love you. And then he'll look up with those bright eyes and say, you love me? How could you love me and you don't even know me? And I say, we love you because you're the future. And we're going to do everything in our power to save your life and cause you to live. Because we understand that in the existence that we are in right now, there is structural racism. But trust me, there are many people who know how to navigate, who understand that system, and can give you the tools to make it down the road. So I stand before you today as someone who I would say, one, understands the issue of race to a certain extent, has experienced structural racism, has been a part of someone who's been damaged by that structural racism from a mental perspective, but also understands that there is a way to make it out if we all work together collectively. Thank you.
I want to thank all of the speakers. Anyway, I want to thank all the speakers. And I know at the end of the last session, there were people who didn't get their questions addressed. If any of you are still in the audience and you still would like to ask a question, is there anyone who was here in the last session, didn't get to? Okay, so we're going to open up there's 2 mics here, open up for questions. And if you could, think about how to frame your question in something that we can ask the panelists, or anyone in this room for that matter. You know, we're all experts at being human, right? What we can do, what we can take out of this room with us and put into action. I mean, each of them has addressed that, but my big reason for getting involved in this today, because I was sitting here in tears when the keynote speaker spoke, talking about the international aspects of racism and mental health and life expectancy. And so if there is an opportunity for us to take something away from here and put it into action as we sit here, as we step out, as we continue going to the panels today and tomorrow, that is why I'm standing here. That is why I got involved. And I've said I too many times. My organizing friends say, stop saying why, it's we. I'm like, but it's me. No, it's we. So anyone have any questions that they would
Hello. I wouldn't pose it as a question, but an answer or a suggestion is something I've done recently. Is I work with the department, well, I work against the Department of Children and Families. I am a court-appointed attorney for children and families, and I have a private practice for family law. And I've just started taking therapy. And I've looked in the mirror, and it's been hard. And I was crying earlier, and it's been hard. Whether it's the security officer who doesn't think I'm an attorney, whether it's department attorneys who have just become so cynical that you see the implicit bias from a brown family to a white family, the sympathy for the families dealing with the opioid crisis, and a very lack of sympathy for brown families dealing with different poverty issues. We should all probably consider going to therapy. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please.
So really quickly, I just want to thank you for sharing that, because one note that I had here around this issue of mental health, and we were talking about this a little earlier, is the fact that the issue with mental health that I see is the disparities in response to mental health. Right, and to mental health issues, right? And there's one thing that I wanted to do that I didn't do up there that I'd like to do now as an example of this, and I'd like to just have a moment of silence. And I'd like to have this moment of silence as a part of bringing the issue of mental health together. And so this moment of silence that I'm gonna ask us to do is really about the mothers who are crying in Chicago who lost all of their children, over 400 murders in Chicago this year to this point. The 43 mothers in Boston who lost children to violence. But I also want to say we have a moment of silence for the Parkland shooting. The difference, and the reason why I'm saying this, is that in the response to those issues, there are disparities. No one's talking about Chicago. Everyone's talking about Parkland, right? So the way that we take an action is we have to ask ourselves, how are we bringing the loss of life into a unified forum? Can we have a moment of silence? Thank you.
My question is kind of piggybacking on what you were saying, Mr. Forrester, and it's something that, as the child of immigrants, as a child, you know, as a proud person that was born in Newark, New Jersey, like, when I'm thinking about all those things, you're talking to young people about the tools to navigate structural racism, but I think a lot about what are those tools? Like, why do some people get out and some people don't when they have access to the same things? I think about that a lot.
Yeah, I would say the response to that is one of the things that I've learned to appreciate about us as human beings is that we're all created different. And so I would say that as someone who is sitting on this panel, and I talked about that I've been incarcerated and have, I would say, successfully re-entered society, but I'm also privileged. And why I say I'm privileged is that I came home to a bed in my house. I came home to a family that would embrace me. And so I'm often saying to people who want to say, why can't other people do that? No, it's not about what other people can do. You have to understand the context of the circumstance that allowed me to flourish. And so, and to your point is, one of the things I think we need to understand and take time, and this is why I say that in the idea of we love you, is how much time are we actually taking to understand the individual? Because all of our trauma and all of our mental health and all of our issues are varied.
If I could speak a little more to that also, I think that as we're all preparing to go into the professional field, we have to be so conscientious about the power that we have as we engage these people of different communities. Speaking from a person from an immigrant community, I remember just a complex that happened in me when we first came to this country, and my entire family would go to doctor's offices. I talk about this story a lot. We'd all go to doctor's offices together. And there was a doctor, and my father comes from the Nuer tribe, and so he has markings across his forehead. They were carved in when he turned 13. When we came to this country, it was always a thing of pride because of where I came from. because it was celebrated and it was something powerful. And in his culture, he can't gain a wife or livestock without it. And when the doctor asked him what it was, my father's a brilliant man who speaks 7 languages, and English just happens to be his weakest. And so when he described to the doctor what had happened, and the doctor's response was, he would have the nurse give him some counseling packets, and he was just appalled that that happened to him. And I think that in a society, we get tattoos here. So I'm wondering why you couldn't find that relatable ground. But that created a complex within me, because I'm looking at the prestige of this representative of this society or this community and what he sees of my father. And so from then on, I didn't want my father coming to like parent-teacher conferences or my basketball games. It was a little bit of embarrassment, but it was also that fear that I had that my father would be judged or deemed savage because something that is so innate to our culture and something that was celebrated. And so as we go into those workforces, be very conscientious and understand of trying to find something relatable within yourself to be able to make a person feel comfortable and emboldened, because you can create those types of complexes.
Yeah, if I can say a little something about that. And I was also inspired and moved by what you had to say as well. And it just reminded me, one of the things I've learned from people involved with Black Lives Matter, and really all the folks that are just, holding it down in this period of Black rebellion, which is what we're living through. We're living through a period of Black rebellion. The rebels are telling us that healing work is movement work. Healing work is movement work. And that work doesn't just happen in a therapist's office. And the healthy mind that I'm thinking about and trying to understand doesn't just happen in my head. It has to happen in the world. And that requires relationships, and that requires a serious contest for power. That's what it involves. And so I also encourage people to, if you're not already directly involved and learning from the people that are involved in this rebellion, learn from them, because one of the things they're specifically learning together is how healing work is movement work, and what that can look like. So I encourage you to do that.
So I am a middle school teacher in Lynn at KIPP, and KIPP Academy is really into systemically fighting education injustice. So a big thing is test scores are really focused on getting kids to have higher SAT scores so they can get into college to improve their outcome in life. But I'm curious about, what do you feel is the other part of that? Because I feel academics is just a small part of a child's life, and especially a middle schooler's life. And a big thing that we hear from students lots how things aren't fair and how everything's not fair, but about things that are really small and don't matter that much. But I'm also sitting here with that knowledge of there are so many things that are really unfair in their life, and how to approach that conversation with them when academics is not the most important thing to them at all.
For me, I'm going to keep beating this dead horse. It's all about representation. I think about even myself in the community, the way that I dress, the way that I carry myself. There's not very many young Black women in my community that have seen immigrants be able to walk behind the doors in courtrooms to go speak to the DA, because that's only where the professionals have gone, and that's only where the white people have gone. And so once they see me cross that threshold, it just opens a door for them, or opens a possibility for them. And so if you can start to give them that representation of those places where they want to reach, it doesn't only have to be academic, it could be through art, it could be through sports, it could be through public speaking, but give them that prestigious representation to let them know that they themselves can reach up to those levels, and they can exist in a pencil skirt and not feel different or feel ashamed or feel like they have to make up for it within a community.
Yeah, I think one aspect of that is just we have to be able to get the courage to push on systems, especially the academic system. There isn't a lot of room and space left or made for young people to actually deal with what is going on with them emotionally. I know that in the academic system, there's a lot of work around social and emotional learning, and a lot of that is around self-regulation, but you can't self-regulate if you don't understand where the pain and the hurt is actually coming from, right? And so, one of the things I wrote on here is how, as a child, my undergrad is in psychology, and I couldn't believe it when I learned about the impact of stress and how it affects the amygdala, right? And how this cortisol, shrinks your amygdala. And there's all of this stuff. And I'm when I started taking, I said, wow, this is so people know this stuff. And I was like, so why do we think the outcomes of young people are going to be different if they're exposed to constant stress and we don't find ways to remove them or help them manage under those circumstances? So the short answer is, I think that, as we have these discussions and leave these spaces, the action item is to think about where you are in the structural systems and what is it can we do as individuals to push on that system to do more.
And I think what I would add is, as somebody who works in academia, I don't think that academics are the most important thing to me either. So maybe they have a point.
I know I'm not a panelist, but I just want to add to that in that my children went to private school on scholarship, and at one point a headmaster, white headmaster, said something to me along the lines of, I was sending my children there so they could be like them. And I was like, no, my children are in this environment because I wanted them to be treated with kindness and respect. It had zero to do with academics. It hadn't even crossed my mind. I was a parochial and a military dependent, had gone to those types of very punitive, restrictive schools, and so I just wanted my children to be treated well. And the academics followed, because if you're grounded in somebody respecting you, then you can relax and learn. So I just had to add that. Which side are we on? This side?
This side. You guys hear me good? Okay. I'm kind of short, my bad. So hi guys, my name is Barbara Joseph. I am a first-generation immigrant, and I'm 18 years old. I like to start off with like a minor statistic. Well, not minor, it's kind of major. So recently I just found out that out of the 100% of psychiatrists we have in the United States, only 5% of them are of color, right? And for the past year and a half, I would say, it's been rather hectic at my school. So somebody called somebody the N-word, and like we did like a march for unity and whatnot, and it was like, okay, cool, but then where do we go from there, right? So like we can march, but then what's gonna happen? So I started this organization called B&B, it's like Black in the Burbs, of course, pre-WI, and what I began to understand was that I had this load on my table. I myself had a bunch of like mental things that I had to figure out, but I was also watching over about 75 students of color in my school, ranging from ages 14 to 18, coming from different backgrounds. It's a MEPCO school, right? And I brought a bunch of my friends in who were poets and musicians and who were in school who were represented powerful people of color. And what we found out was that it created an open space. We had boys crying because they were writing poems about how they felt and they've never experienced that before. We had girls writing poems about saying, oh, I'm not smart enough, I just work hard, and created a space where they began to find themselves. But the question I have is that, would you guys be willing to come to those spaces? Because for once I've actually noticed, I have 8 brothers, right? And I'm the only girl, and I've never seen them really cry. And it wasn't until this past year that I saw my younger brother cry, saying that he didn't feel good enough walking outside those doors. And that was powerful to me. And it was really hard for me to stand here and not cry, because for once in my life, I actually feel as if I'm supporting this movement, right? And the question that I actually have is, not only can you guys support that and be willing to come to the spaces because they need more people like you guys, and how do you see that we can replicate this amongst the entire world, since it is a worldly issue?
I would definitely be willing to come to those spaces. And I'm really, really moved that you use the arts. I'm a spoken word poet, and I use a lot of the poetry to be able to tell a story. And I just see how differently it's just accepted, because it just brings down a certain defense mechanism. And so it softens the area. I would say one of the biggest things is continuing the movement. Not only continue the movement, I always say when you don't see yourself represented at a table, pull up a seat. There's so many places where I have to sit with my discomfort so that I could be at a table to be privy to certain things that I could correct in those small places, because I think that that's really, really important. And so never think that anywhere that you are is trivial, or anything that you say is not going to be powerful, because it's going to plant a seed.
That's right, that's right.
And I'll give you my information after.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
Well, I just know that we have timekeepers. Our time, we have 15 minutes. Okay, good. I just wanted to be sure we could get all the questions in. Go ahead, sorry.
So I just want to say yes, that I would definitely come out. And, as we have this conversation, I think about structural racism, and from looking at you as a young sister, one of the things that I want us to be able to have a discussion about is how there's overt structural racism and covert structural racism. And what I mean by that is I think about the narratives that are being told to our brown and black boys in music today, right? But I don't only look at that from the context of the fact that they are responsible for what they're saying, but I think about the backdoor financial influence of people who don't look like them that tell them your music is not going to play on the radio unless you say this. And so we need to have a conversation fully about how systems and narratives are being influenced to make our different cultures, different groups that are not the majority, think about themselves. And so, yes, I will come, and I'm looking forward to having a conversation.
Oh, sorry, but in addition, actually, we did a study about that the entire year. I didn't allow them to play like misogynistic music or crazy music or whatever in the classroom, and then we did like analytics over it, and like I'm really into data, and we realized there was like a really positive impact within the space. We got a bunch of students into honor roll, thinking positively about themselves, and like it was just about it. So thank you.
So I'm gonna need you to come to me.
So thank you guys for sharing. I just really wanted to open up a conversation, which could really be for anybody in the room, was a term that I learned recently, and I learned it not because I read it in the dictionary, but it was something that I felt, and then I found out later that there was a word for it, and it's racial battle fatigue. And this is something that I felt it in college. I was a sociology major at Northeastern, and there was just a lot of pressure of a lot of times being the only person of color in the classroom, talking about race, class, and gender. And so I just really wanted to kind of see what you guys' thoughts on, or what other people have experienced, how to fight it, and how to support those who are going through it as well, and internalizing a lot of the things that we've been talking about.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, I'm familiar with the term, and I think it's a very useful term. It's very evocative, but I also think that it sort of liberates us from using these sort of euphemisms to talk about what people are experiencing. Because if you have battle fatigue, the question is, who are you battling? You need to name those people, right? And then they can take responsibility for the fact that they are in a battle, and as I said earlier, that they are in fact playing offense. Like, black people are not just feeling bad, okay? We gotta stop talking about it as if that's what's happening. Things are being done to us that would make any human being feel bad. And so the people who are doing that need to stop, right? But if we don't even name them, and we keep talking about it as this state of being that we're in, I don't think that that's particularly helpful. And that's why I think that the idea of racial battle fatigue, I think it brings language into the conversation that is helpful, but we need to be precise. Battle fatigue from whom? Because then if you want to take that metaphor further, then we can talk about peace and reconciliation, right? But if part of the battle is not being named and doesn't want to be peaceful, there is no reconciliation. Y'all feel me? So that's what I'll say about that.
I just wanted to say something. When I hear that term, I find it so unfortunate that I have to even come from this place, but I feel like we don't have the luxury, because when you're fatigued, if you think about battle in a regular sense, you're going to be penetrated. And so when we're walking around in our day-to-day, like my colleague had said, that we're constantly on a moment-to-moment basis having all these questions of 4 ways that we could go because of the anxiety that we carry, because of the colors that we exist in. That fatigue is not a luxury that we could just tap into and say, time out. I'm under this fatigue, so I'm gonna need a time to recuperate, or anything like that, because then those are now translated as mannerisms and characteristics that further drive the stigma of like us either being lazy, being the angry black woman. And so it definitely helps bring the language in, but I think that it reveals a much more insidious realization that, it sucks.
Yeah, and just one quick thing. I think that, when I think about that statement, because I actually would tie that into what I said I felt when we had to say Black Lives Matter, right? That's that racial battle fatigue, right? And The other part of it that I would say, though, I think it's important for, and I'm going to focus on Black and brown people in this statement, is how are we actually building back and rebuilding our own esteem? Because no matter what someone says, and I'm a father of 5 and I'm raising 4 children, and I said, I don't care what anybody says about you. You need to remember in your esteem what we feel and say about you. Because at some point there has to be something that you hold on to that's greater than what is coming from the external forces. And if you don't have that, then we'll always be a victim of racial battle fatigue.
One more thing related to this. I like to joke sometimes, and people don't always find this funny, but that's cool. I like to say that racism doesn't take a day off, so neither can I. That's the fatigue.
Oh, hey guys, my name is Fajina. I'm a senior at Arlington High School, and I'm currently here today with our Black Student Union Club. I grew up in Arlington, which is a predominantly white town, so racism is something that I've always dealt with in town, at school, or just in general. And mental health is something like my family never really talks about. Like, I grew up in a very strong Haitian household, so like a prayer is the answer to everything. So racism, we never touch base on that. I guess my question is, how can I talk about these topics with my fellow peers back at my school? Because it is a very hard topic to discuss and have people actually like listen to you. My school does a very good job at trying to like educate people on this topic. Like last year we started this thing called Inclusion Day, where we try to educate people about those topics, but I feel like there's a piece missing, or there's something that needs to be done and we haven't done. So I was asking, like, how can we go about educating people my age and high schoolers about these topics and actually make them listen? And also I was wondering if you guys would be willing to come to my school and talk with students as well, because I think, I think you guys have an amazing story that people just need to hear, and it definitely has impacted me and it changed my mindset today, and I think that my school definitely needs to hear this, and yeah.
So I think that one of the most important things is not to be dictated by the Western construct and concept of the mental health system, because it's a work. And also, I think that you need to also collect data to have an understanding of what is perceived to be mental wellness, because your idea of mental wellness or your idea of what mental health or the progression of somebody's mental state, you can't be the one to delineate it. I think that's what's been one of the most dangerous things that I have seen, especially working with people from the immigrant communities who come here with their own ideas of what the mental health system, and they still exist to this day, so it has carried their civilization to this point. So I think that that needs to be considered, because there's a resilience within our communities. Unfortunately, and sometimes fortunately, it's built from hardship, it's built from crises, but there is a resilience within us. And so I also think that needs to be integrated into the mental health system, because then we run the risk of re-traumatizing people, because our understanding of what trauma is means that this must hurt and this has to hurt, and you have to deal with that and sit in that hurt, where with some communities, like I said, we don't have the luxury. And so we have to move forward, and we have to start to really move from a strength-based place. So I would say going and having the conversations with people, not to only teach, but to also learn what the idea of mental wellness is, and then be able to make it an interactive conversation. It's definitely something important.
Yeah, I would say, first of all, I want to say, you're amazing. And the other young lady that stepped up is also amazing, because you're in spaces and places where people see you as the sort of responsible for shaping and reshaping how people think in those spaces, right? And that's not fair to you, right? So I want to start by saying that. I want to say that, like, that's not a burden young people who are living their lives and have aspirations should carry. So I want to say, that you're amazing first and foremost. The other piece of it, I think, is, how do you really connect with a small group of people who are in that space that are committed to actually the evolution of that space, but also themselves. And so when you said that to me, it made me think about when I was incarcerated. And I always say that when I was incarcerated, it was one of the spaces and places that I first was challenged to come to my own reality, because there were men who were willing to actually spend time and really challenge me on the way that I thought, and really asked me if that is what I wanted for the rest of my life. And then I transitioned from being open in that way, to also a space where there were a group of us who said, we understand what we need to do to be better. And what we did was we created our own healing space. And so what I would say, in the midst of whatever is happening at the school with those folks, we have to understand that we got to take some ownership for creating our own healing space. And understand that there's going to be some racial battle anxieties around that, but that's okay, because it's a part of the process of transforming spaces and places, and we have to be up for that battle. So anything you need around support and understanding like how to baseline that and how to move that forward, I'm sure everyone here can support you and pull up the rear for you to be able to create that space within that system.
Okay, thank you guys.
I'm sorry, I just have to say something really quick. Sorry, just to piggyback off what you're saying, when you're creating that safe space, make sure that you disarm everybody at the door. And what I mean by that is just to speak to myself. I think one of the most hurtful, the most time that it's most hurt that somebody made a judgment against my skin color has been from Black men.
That's right.
And that happened when I went down south in the military. That was the first time that I've experienced that level of racism and not know how to react, because this is my brother, this is a person who should have shared the same oppression. And so it made me very, very confused about how to exist and how to, maneuver conversations within my own community. So when I say disarm at the doors, make sure that you touch on those conversations about how the oppression that we deal with has now started to build complexities and manifests itself within our own communities and safe spaces.
I would also say, trying to figure out how to put this. This is what I have learned. Race talk is not liberation. Okay? So there is much work to be done that is already waiting to be done that does not require you to spend any time trying to convince white people to have a conversation. You don't have to spend a lot of time doing that. I mean, if you want it, that's cool, do you, But if we're talking about getting free, that's not at the top of the agenda, you know what I'm saying? And so there are folk right now who can use your energy, your talent, what you have to get real work done that has nothing to do with just trying to get some folk to even say the word race. I'm just saying.
Hello, my name is Nikita Ramo. I think I'm one of the first generations of Haitian immigrants, and I can relate to what the young lady is talking about. And I came to this country when the time that Brother Forrester was referring to the busing. But I lived in Cambridge, so I was reading it in the paper and I was seeing it on TV. And I had people, I don't know if you remember, those of us who are older, like the Haitian guy who dropped over, he said he's Haitian. Yes. I think I still have that clip. So anyway, this is that area that frames my growing up in Boston. Okay, so I can relate to you. But right now I'm a teacher, but I'm not working in the classroom. I'm no longer in the classroom because of structural racism. And I know it can be anti-academic, but I have to read the research. So where I'm coming from is that there are 26,000 teachers between 2003 and 2012 where we moved from the classroom. So how can we use those teachers? How can we use those Black teachers to really start dealing with the mental health issues? Because some of those mental health issues have to deal with the environment that the kids are in. So they are in a foreign environment, they are dealing with people that they don't know. So all these, the child may be normal, but it's like, it's affecting the kid. So I think what I'm asking is, I'm going to read the research. I'm going to read it because when I tell people like 26,000 teachers between 2003 and 2012 have been taken out of the classroom, but they don't believe me. So let me tell you, that research comes from the National Institute for Early Education Research. And it was published by Christina Rizga in Mother Jones magazine, Tuesday, September 16, 2016. According to the Albert Schenker Institute, which is funded in part by the American Federation of Teachers, AFT, Federation of Teachers, who financed this article, this research. The number of Black educators has declined sharply in some of the largest urban school districts in the nation. In Philadelphia, the number of Black teachers declined by 18.5% between 2001 and 2012. In Chicago, the black teacher population dropped by nearly 40%. And in New Orleans, there was 62% drop in the number of black teachers that after New Orleans, 7,000 black teachers lost their jobs. I was in Xavier University, and this is the first time, I think it was 2010, 2011, that I came upon black psychology. So I didn't know there was a specific area in black psychology. So as a teacher, I used to use holistic, but I would put W-HOL. I would put holistic, so we had to deal with the whole child. But right now I'm learning mental health issues, so we do have to deal with the mental health issues. So what I'm asking is anybody can help me use identifying the teachers in Boston who've been kicked out of the classroom because we care so much. It's not, they use, like this article is using fake school turnarounds, charter schools, but mainly, you have a lot of teachers who care too much. They don't want you. They don't want teachers who are involved. They don't want us to, those of us who are close to the community, those of us who understand the community, they don't want us. So what I'm looking for is some support to identify those among those in Boston area, in the Boston area, who've been kicked out of the classroom. So how can we go back in the community to work with that young lady, to work in those schools, to be in those schools and teach those cultures?
Yeah. Can I say something to the point that Phillipe keeps making about free? And as I watch how all of the this institutional racism and all these conversations are being had around the issues of low income, black and brown folks, ethnic groups, et cetera, is being played out in this country, and I always say to my wife often, the one thing that I learned in academia that was great for me in history was you can create a government in America within the government. And I was like, wow, that's a powerful statement. And why? Because what I come to realize is that true freedom is not always about trying to push on the system as it is. What makes America what it is the opportunity to create a system within the system. And so when we talk about sort of this idea around black teachers and the sort of the attrition of black teachers throughout this country, what I ask myself is also, I flip that and say, okay, now we have the Amigos and we have LeBron James and we have Oprah Winfrey and we have all these people that are making millions of dollars. Why are not black and brown people creating their own system of education within this system? I don't get it. Like, to the point that was just made, I don't want to spend a bunch of time actually trying to convince the white power structure to accept, one, and to create, two, systems for our community to thrive. What I'd like to spend my time on is to say, you have money, you're a millionaire, you're a billionaire, we have an attrition of teachers that are all over this country. Let's create a system within this system to educate and to build a movement around building the capacity of our ethnic group. Because we have the resources. So in some ways, we're still thinking like 1955 and 1960, where we didn't have the resources that we needed to create a system. We no longer live there. And so this is what I love mostly about the younger generations, because they're looking at, wait a minute, time out. Like, I don't want to be asking you to give me anything. So I would say, I understand what you're saying about the academic system, but I challenge us and those of us who don't look like me, who want to be a part of that movement, how are we going to create an advocacy objective that actually doesn't focus on government funding, but like charter schools are doing, actually focuses on those who have the capacity and millions of dollars to create a system within this system?
Yes, I've said that. 26,000 teachers, so we have enough. We are enough, to teach our kids. Why aren't we doing it?
That's right. Because of structural racism.
Yeah, so, can I? Oh, thank you. So I just wanted to add a little bit to what I said, because I don't want to get it twisted, y'all, all right? There are, and there have always been, since day one, some white folk who get it. From day one of this nonsense, there were white people who said this is wrong and tried to do something about it. So find those folk and get to work. All right? Because they are there. And where your work can get done, get some work done. And the other folk just like, okay, you're still frozen in some amber around some real basic stuff. like Jurassic era around race. I ain't got time for that. Let me find the white folk that are ready to do some work, who have been doing it all along, and let's get to work.
If I could just make a suggestion I would say connect to the who want to get all the teachers together. We're in an era of social media, so I would definitely say using social media and even connecting with the young women and building some sort of initiative around that would definitely be the start of that conversation, or be a help towards that start.
My question is a short one. I just wanted to know, my question is short. I just wanted to know, in your experiences, through your trials and your tribulations, and in the profession that you find yourself in today, how do you cope, or how do you find yourself dealing with survivor's guilt?
Amazing. That's a great question. I want to say, that the survivor's guilt, right? I want to say the biggest part for me in addressing the fact that, so I'm going to say I don't have survivor's guilt, and the reason why is because I haven't left anyone behind. And the reason why I can say that is because every day, right, as a black man, I try to represent my best self. And when I say as a black man trying to represent my best self, is that an opportunity like this is an opportunity for me. That's why I'm foremost about saying I'm an ex-offender and I'm a re-entering citizen, right? Because hopefully somebody in here who has the wrong perception of what somebody who's been incarcerated might look like, it is changing their perception today. Secondly, I would say that in the movement that I'm in order to represent myself, I'm always trying to think about how am I able to bring those who are really on board along, right? And I use the word in quotes on board because you can't bring everybody with you. And sometimes we have survivor's guilt for the wrong people who really don't want to move nowhere. So I want to make sure that I have, and who I'm thinking about is actually in perspective. The third piece that I would say to that question is that there are too many people trying to save other people that haven't saved themselves. And so the survivor's guilt comes in because when you haven't really focused on, or when we haven't really focused on the work we need to do to establish ourselves, and it's interesting because I have a mentee that's here, and James Mackey, some of you may know him, and it makes me I think about him because we were having this conversation on the way here, and one of the things I was saying to him, and he lives, we live together, he lives at my house, and he's making moves, but one of the things I was saying to him is that that's a struggle that I see, is that too many times people who are in the struggle are trying to rescue people in the struggle and have nothing to offer. And so the way that I've minimized any guilt in my life is by saying, once I get to a place where I've taken care of myself well enough and I'm able to position myself to push on systems, I have to ask myself, what am I offering to someone else? And every day my work is to think about how am I offering something to someone else or to a space where survivor's guilt is not a part of my life, because everything I'm doing is not just for me.
And I also would like to add that not in the same way survivals, it doesn't necessarily exist, but it's only because I realized that I only survived into another plane of battle. Mm-hmm. And so all I could do is equip myself the best that I can in that new plane and how I could teach. The guilt would be if I didn't take everything that I have learned in whatever step that I took forward and didn't give it back to the people who are climbing or either alongside me or behind me. I think that's where the guilt should start to set in. But I think that one a scary thing that I realized is that, I might have survived one oppressive tunnel or one oppressive movement, but I only graduated to a newer one, so I needed to just flex my muscles and start to, build myself enough strength to be able to battle this one and be able to take the information back to my community.
So we ran over time, but what I'd like to do, if you can, just ask the question, so we can get your questions on record, okay?
Okay. We've talked a lot about the value of considering trauma and its impact. And I guess as a social work student who genuinely wants to fix the system, as I'm sure everybody in this room does, I'm just wondering if you have any advice on, how do we take such individual, personal, and unique trauma and use it to form policies that are universal, or are there systems out there that are working that we can adapt?
Okay, next person.
My question is, I'm from Jamaica. Why are African Americans still so in this state of feeling guilty and of feeling like they don't have strength. Like they let the word nigger control them, all of their emotion, everything. Why are they still so weak to words, to situations? Like it's not like they're learning, you know, it's the same over and over attitude, thinking, style. That nobody's graduating the mindset. Why is that?
We can't answer. I wanted to get the questions on record. Your question, or?
I did. So I, from a greater understanding, and even ever since I was young as 16, I've noticed the differences of, you know, how I lived in my environment versus someone who lives in a suburban environment. And, you know, I believe in action. I believe in action and not just raising awareness. If we provide enough action in which everyone as a group, in which we all face and let everyone know of our problems, can the systemic disadvantages that we are facing as POC, can we overcome them in the next generations? I know this is a very hard question to answer, but I just want to know if there is hope.
Yeah, there is hope. I believe there's hope. For all the bad things that happen in a day that we hear about, there's much more good. I believe that if things get out of balance, we won't be here to talk about it. So there's always more good things happening every day than bad things. We just hear about the bad things. We can't answer your question here, but your question has been noted.
Thank you.
And I want to thank you all. I've just seen attentive listening, active listening faces, and we really appreciate that. Thank you very much.